World powers are turning to Yemen as concern grows about the country's role as a hotbed for Al-Qaeda. The US and UK have already pledged more security assistance to Sana'a. But how would that curb Al-Qaeda? And could Yemen be the next international quagmire? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Sahil Rahman. On Sunday, the US and British embassies shut down indefinitely in Yemen. The reason? Fear of an Al-Qaeda attack. A statement on the US Embassy website says the threats are by the group's Yemen-based offshoot called Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. The threats come in the wake of a failed attack on a US plane on Christmas Day. The Nigerian man who tried to blow up the plane allegedly told investigators that he has links to the group and was trained in Yemen. Al-Qaeda has been increasing its influence in Yemen, claiming a series of attacks, including a coordinated suicide attack on the US Embassy in the capital Sana'a in September last year, killing 16 people. US President Barack Obama said his priority will now be to strengthen security partnerships with Yemen.
In recent years, they've bombed Yemeni government facilities and Western hotels, restaurants and embassies, including our embassy in 2008, killing one American. So as president, I've made it a priority to strengthen our partnership with the Yemeni government, training and equipping their security forces, sharing intelligence, and working with them to strike Al-Qaeda terrorists. And even before Christmas Day, we had seen the results. Training camps have been struck, leaders eliminated, plots disrupted.
Well, for his part, British Prime Minister Gordon Brown said more has to be done as Yemen has now become an international issue.
Yemen has been recognised, like Somalia, to be one of the areas where we've got to not only keep an eye on, but we've got to do more. So it's strengthening counter-terrorism cooperation, it's working harder on the intelligence efforts, and of course it's this same thing that I'm talking about, which is, I think, going to become a feature of this decade. How we can prevent the perversion of a good religion, Islam, by a group of people who will stop at nothing in a murderous ideology.
Well, joining me today to discuss this further from Sana'a, we have Hakim Al-Masmari, publisher and editor-in-chief of the English language Yemen Post. From London, we're joined by Michael Griffin, an author and Al-Qaeda expert. And finally, from Philadelphia, we have Bill ROGGIO, founder of the Long War Journal, which catalogues daily developments in America's so-called war on terror. Gentlemen, welcome to Inside Story. Michael Griffin, can I begin with you in London? If Yemen is the new front against Al-Qaeda, how worrying is this really for the international community?
I think the international community needs to be very, very calm about the way in which it interprets what took place on Christmas Day and the linkages with Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. It seems to me that we're doing very much a kind of a Groundhog Day in QAEDA, in Yemen, compared to what we did in Afghanistan 8-9 years ago, which is to say that we allowed a very, very serious attack on human life and property in New York City and Washington to set in motion a stream of events and consequences which have still not really unraveled. We have to be very careful not to repeat the same mistakes in Yemen. Because Yemen is also, like Afghanistan, a very, very poor place.
Sorry to have interrupted that, Michael. I thought you'd finished that.
Okay.
Bill ROGGIO in Philadelphia, would you agree with that?
I would half agree with that. I mean, we do need to be very careful about how we move forward. I think any Western presence on the Arabian Peninsula is certainly very good recruiting fodder for Al-Qaeda. However, I mean, we do have to recognize that we have cells that are in Yemen, and I mean, I would disagree that Yemen is the new front in the first of all in the war. You know, Yemen has been a front in this war for quite some time. In 2002, there was a strike that killed a senior Al-Qaeda operative there. So this has been an ongoing thing, and you have in Yemen. It's compared to Afghanistan, but I think it's really more comparable to Pakistan, where you have a lawless tribal areas. You have a very tribal society. Al-Qaeda has integrated itself in there well. Training camps, support, and a government that, in a lot of cases, either turns the other cheek towards Al-Qaeda, or in some cases actively colludes with it in its operations. So yes, we do have to be careful with how we tread in Yemen, and we need to be careful about how, who we're supporting in the Yemeni government and where the money is going there, because we could be funneling money directly to Al-Qaeda. Okay, well, Hakim Al-Masmari, let's get your perspective on this. I mean, the international community are taking this quite seriously. We've had General Petraeus making his third visit to the country in, 14 months now. So how are you actually analysing what's going on in terms of the violence your country is experiencing and the international focus that's on it right now?
I would consider it a political game, because being in Yemen, we know that Al-Qaeda is not a force at all. Al-Qaeda followers do not number more than 400. But the fuss that they're giving right now by the U.S. government and the Western countries are giving Al-Qaeda more than what it deserves. However, for those who think that attacks on Al-Qaeda, like the ones that happened 2 weeks ago in Abyad and Shabwa, which killed only civilians, will help the war on Al-Qaeda, are mistaken. These attacks will only make it worse. And U.S. war history shows us that Americans are never accurate when they deal with Al-Qaeda. Always civilians are the ones who face the death penalty. And then day by day, we have more people joining Al-Qaeda, not because they are loyal to them, but because they want to get revenge from the Americans or government for killing one of their loved ones in attacks that happened accidentally, as the Americans usually say, to civilians.
Michael Griffin, isn't that the problem in Yemen, and perhaps reflected in other countries with a similar issue, that when domestic governments try to intervene to quell an uprising, whatever that may be, those that are disaffected or affected by the incident then are, you might say, corralled by those that can offer them a better alternative. And this is what Al-Qaeda has been very successful at doing, has it not?
Well, I don't think Al-Qaeda has ever really offered any form of manifesto which could be interpreted as a better alternative to a sitting government. However, I think certainly in Pakistan, you'll find that the population rapidly turned against local Taliban and obviously their Al-Qaeda allies when they saw the kinds of impact they were having upon domestic security and the murder of local citizens. In terms of Yemen, I think that we are overreacting, and I think that the idea that one Nigerian jihadist and 300, 400 Al-Qaeda fighters, many of them coming from Saudi Arabia but settled in the border areas in Yemen, should be determining and dictating Western policy toward the government in Sana'a is seriously a mistake. And I think we have to step back while considering a measured response, which doesn't just take into consideration Yemen but also Somalia and a swathe of poverty-stricken countries across North Africa and the Sahel.
Okay, Mr. Al-Masmari, how do you then help Yemen, or how do international governments help Yemen without increasing, you might say, their international presence? And how much help does Yemen want without being accused by its own public of kowtowing to international governments?
The only way that Yemen can be helped is politically. Anything that is used by force can never help Yemenis. We all know that Saudi Arabia has more Al-Qaeda members than Yemen, maybe 10 times more than Yemen. But only because Yemen is a weak country politically, the Western nations feel that it's okay to bother a country where the politics are going weak, economic situation is very weak in Yemen. So this country would be easier to deal with than Saudi Arabia. But the only way to deal with Yemen is to help Yemen as a country politically, help the development of Yemen, give people other options. Al-Qaeda members usually follow the Al-Qaeda path because they have no other options, only to follow them.
So how do you react then?
How
do you react then to the United States saying that it's going to increase its budget aid to Yemen?
In the past couple of years, the U.S. has only shown us that it's failure in wars. You cannot compare Pakistan to Yemen. When you say you have thousands of Taliban in Pakistan, that's because Afghanistan is next to Pakistan. But which country is next to Yemen that has thousands of Al-Qaeda members? Most of Al-Qaeda members in Yemen are very quiet and on the down low. That is because they have agreement to the government not to harm anything in the country. And the Al-Qaeda has made it clear that we are not here to harm the country or to harm the army of Yemen Yemen or the government. We're only after American interest in the country. So the only way that could happen is that if the U.S. gives the support, but they don't give the government conditions on how to fight Al-Qaeda. We all know that Yemen, as Yemenis, that most of the killings that happen in Yemen are because of land disputes. So yesterday, they were telling me that the idea of having U.S. forces inside Yemen is an option. This will only make it worse. Yemenis will never accept having international forces inside a country where they think they're living peacefully and quietly. And no one in Yemen thinks that Al-Qaeda is even a threat.
And certainly that hasn't been mooted at all. We're only talking about the money that's possibly been offered by the United States and the UK. And obviously this conference at the end of January, Bill ROGGIO will perhaps outline a way forward that perhaps Western governments might be able to help Yemen. I just wondered what sort of pressure Al-Qaeda has been, from your perspective, if you think that they have been got rid of out of possibly Iraq and elements within Saudi Arabia and the focus on Yemen. I mean, there has been this thought amongst analysts across the globe that this is the trend now, that as Al-Qaeda gets routed, they move to another area. Is that the thinking where you are?
Yeah, that by and large is correct. I mean, when Al-Qaeda did, and I think it's clear that we could recognize Al-Qaeda suffered a strategic defeat in Iraq. And look, Yemen provided one of the largest contingents of foreign fighters to Iraq. A lot of them have returned home. Yes, there are Saudis have fled the operations, the pressure in Saudi Arabia, and have come across and established Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. You know, I also think that it's not a very good idea for U.S. forces to go into Yemen. I think we need to act very carefully here. But, you know, as the gentleman before me just said, I mean, the Yemeni government has an agreement with Al-Qaeda. Just as long as they don't attack the Yemeni government, then, you know, everything's fine. Well, that might be fine for the state of Yemen, but that is not fine for the international community. The United States, Britain, the rest of the West has, you know, they're not going to sit by idly while Al-Qaeda sits there, plots, trains, and is ready to conduct, you know, attacks, as we had on Christmas, you know, the Christmas Day attack. You know, again, I don't know what the solution is to dealing with Al-Qaeda in Yemen. I think that anyone does really hasn't sat down and thought this one through, because it is a very complex problem. And at least in the case of Pakistan, you know, you have a large military that can, if it could be pushed, could take on Al-Qaeda and the Taliban in the tribal areas. Mm-hmm. In Yemen, I don't believe that the Yemeni state has the power, given that it has problems in the north and the south, to go in and handle Al-Qaeda out in the provinces. And
of course, this has all come to light, of course, after the Christmas Day attempt to bring down a US liner into Detroit. Let's give our viewers a little bit of background about Al-Qaeda in Yemen. Well, the group's activities in the country have never really abated since the late 1990s. Early last year, Saudi and Yemeni branches of Al-Qaeda announced their merger into Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, with Yemen as their base. The ancestral home of bin Laden, the country, has long been a source of so-called jihadis and is one of the biggest suppliers of fighters to regional conflicts. As we've just heard on this programme, with its weak central government, civil war in the north and rebels in the south, Yemen is proving to be a base of choice for some of the group. Michael Griffin, in the early part of the last decade, 2003 and 4, Yemen-US cooperation to fight militant groups, if we can call them that, was going pretty well until 2006. What seems to have gone wrong with the working relationship between either the Yemeni government and international agencies and governments trying to come down on militant groups?
I think that there was an intensification of cooperation, it seemed, after the attack on the USS Cole back in 2000, the year before 9/11. And this took place in Aden Harbour, and it was then that the kind of links between Al-Qaeda in the Yemen area, in the Arabian Peninsula, but not in the Yemen area, and also the attacks on the embassies in Nairobi and Tanzania, became evident. And so there was an intensification of collaboration between the US and Yemen to try to get to grips with this. But at that time, it seemed that the Yemeni government wanted to show results without necessarily demonstrating the kind of commitment required to eliminating Al-Qaeda in the area. And this is for some of the reasons that Bill said, because it to some extent counts upon its assistance as a cadre of veterans from Iraq, or in those days from the Afghan jihad, to work as mercenaries. Since then, the United States has played two sides against the middle. It has insisted on collaboration while at the same time reducing Yemeni access to development aid in the form of debt forgiveness. It is a democracy. It's the poorest country in the Middle East. It requires a great deal of development assistance, given that it's going to run out of what little oil it has. And all of these things, I think, have contributed to a kind of feeling that they had in Afghanistan after after the end of the jihad, which was they were neglected. They did something and then they were neglected. They didn't get rewarded, and I think that's what we're seeing the results of here.
Sure. Hakim Al-Masri in Sana'a, and one understands your position in that you're saying that the problem needs to be solved by maybe proper investment in its people and in the infrastructure of the country. But the harsh reality is that there is a problem in Yemen, is there not, with Al-Qaeda type groups and as well as intertribal fighting. How does a weak Yemeni government become strong? What does the Yemeni hierarchy have to do?
We made a survey at the Yemen Post last week, and this survey showed that only 6% of Yemenis fear that Al-Qaeda is a threat in Yemen. Al-Qaeda is not considered a threat at all by Yemenis, only for a very small margin of them. Now, if the West wants to improve Yemen as a country in whole, it needs to build a real democracy in Yemen, not to come and make Yemen into another Somalia or Afghanistan. History has shown us that Yemen cannot change only with real democracy and a government that's transparent. If the U.S. government and the West wants to improve Yemen as a country, it needs to show that, or to force the country in Yemen and the president himself in specific, that Yemen must be a democratic country in order for change to happen. Now, if you look at Afghanistan, Obama, last month, he said that they are willing to negotiate with Taliban for those who are moderate. President Saleh was doing the same for the last 7 years. He was negotiating how to deal with Al-Qaeda over the last 7 years. So the same policy that President Obama is doing right now with Al-Qaeda and Taliban in Afghanistan is the same policy that President Saleh has been doing in Yemen for the last 7 years. But to solve the problem, you need to solve it. I'm sorry?
It's not working, though, is it? Even if you look at from the tribal perspectives, you've got the Houthis in the north, the Al-Qaeda issue in the south, and those groups, well, certainly in the north, the Shiite rebels, as the government in Sana'a is calling them, is certainly not losing this so-called war with the government. There's a problem there, isn't there? Obviously, agreements aren't working.
Yes. The reason for the problems in the south and the north are reason that the country is not dealing with the people in a very democratic way, and the people are not talking. Freedom is not there. But if you want to solve the problems, whether with Al-Qaeda, the Houthis, or the southern movements, it must be done through political meanings, not through war. And the examples of the north and the south are just easy examples. Now, you said that Al-Qaeda, it has not worked on Al-Qaeda over the last 7 years. We see that attacks in Yemen happen every year, whereas in Iraq and Afghanistan, it happens on a daily basis. So you cannot compare a thing that happens rarely to something that happens on a daily basis.
Sure. Okay, well, let's give some more background for our viewers. In 2009, the US provided $67 million in training and support to Yemen. On Friday, the US said it would more than double counter-terrorism aid to Yemen this year. Speaking to Al Jazeera on Monday, Yemen's foreign minister said any help given will be on his own country's terms.
Yemen is going to deal with terrorism in its own way and out of its own interests. What will be negative impact on Yemen is if there is a direct intervention of the US. And this is not the case.
Well, it seems that whatever the government says, Michael Griffin, it seems that an amalgamation of these Al-Qaeda groups, whether they're from Yemen or Saudi Arabia, and we have to really focus on this whole term of Al-Qaeda and whether this is just a philosophy or organised groups. Many believe it really is just a philosophy with splinter groups around the globe. With what's happening in Yemen, how much heart do you think they're going to give some of their neighbours, like in Somalia?
I don't know. This is a difficult one to answer. I think that there are obviously connections between Somali Al-Qaeda, if you want to call it the Shabab, and the Yemeni branches, but that Yemen has been a pipeline for weapons for a long, long time to Somali groups fighting each other for the most part. And of course it's also benefited to some extent, I guess, through money supplied and raised and then supplied through hijacking and holding to ransom shipping in the Red Sea. So there's a contiguity and obviously an underlying possible alliance, but I don't think it's yet really coalesced, correctly speaking. A lot of Somalis without work, but a lot of fighting experience, have been migrating toward Yemen to offer their services left and right. I think the one thing we're not quite focusing on here is the extent to which AQAAP is beginning to hold the government of Yemen to ransom by reaching for targets above whatever agreements it may have made with the government in Sana'a, which are global and international and reflect, let us say, the kinds of things that Osama bin Laden's Al-Qaeda was seeking to gain. Secondly, I think we never quite look at the sources of funding for resurgent Al-Qaeda cells like the one that exists in parts of Yemen. It is getting...
Hasn't that always been difficult?
From Guantanamo Bay.
Hasn't that always been difficult, though? Sorry, Michael. Hasn't that always been difficult to try and find where the money train is? And previous to what you recently just said, are you talking about like a global caliphate, that sort of philosophy that Al-Qaeda is trying to expose?
No, I don't think it's quite as grandiose or as organised as that. I don't think the caliphate thing works. I really can't see the Somalis, for example, advocating a caliphate, but I can see them seeking to kind of establish a unified Somalia by introducing some Wahhabi principles of discipline and organisation and Sharia law. Those kinds of things I think would work if Ethiopia would let them and if the US would stop Ethiopia from preventing that happening. But the idea of a good Sharia, good Al-Qaeda does not really exist in the mentality of the West. As for the money thing, without going into too much detail, we understand that there is money. Revolutions are driven by money. Insurgencies are driven by money. But it's not very transparent what kind of research has been carried out to where that money comes from. And clearly, in this case, it comes from Saudi Arabia.
Well, we're nearly running out of time. I just want to come to one other issue. I know there's a lot to discuss, and perhaps we have very limited time, unfortunately. Bill ROGGIO, there is a dilemma now for the US president. He has, up to maybe 90 Yemenis detainees in Guantanamo. He's firstly promised to close Guantanamo, but now doesn't know, or his administration doesn't know what to do with those detainees on the back of what happened on Christmas Day. What do you think the government should be doing in the United States, and what do you think they will do?
Yeah, you know, the issue of Guantanamo Bay here and across the world obviously is quite controversial, and you know, the amount of Yemeni detainees is just disproportionate. The U.S. really doesn't know how it's going to handle these detainees or how it's going to handle the rest of the Guantanamo Bay detainees. Look, the U.S. Congress does not want these detainees to be detained in the United States. The conflict that exists with Guantanamo is just extremely difficult. What's going to happen? You know, look, the recidivist rate, I believe, out of Guantanamo is, and this is just what we know, is around 12%. I mean, and you know, look, I was in Mosul in 2008. An Al-Qaeda, a former Guantanamo detainee, conducted a suicide attack there that killed 13 Iraqi soldiers. He was released to Kuwait. This is happening, and even if they're not going out and conducting attacks, a lot of these former detainees are providing some type of support for Al-Qaeda or the Taliban in some manner. And with the poor security situation in Yemen, the administration is going to be handcuffed in transferring these detainees. The U.S. Congress is not going to let them go onto U.S. soil. I think they're just going to remain in limbo for years. And, you know, instead of having a process of a tribunal, which I think is appropriate, given that, you know, we were at war and these were detained on a battlefield, instead of having that would give you some clarity. We're now going to have a process where these detainees are going to be in limbo for years to come. And you know, the prospect, whatever they thought that they were going to get out of the administration was going to get out of closing Guantanamo, I think it's just going to make the situation worse and worsen in the international community's perceptions.
Well, I think we'll have a clearer idea of what happens in the coming days, and certainly perhaps a clearer idea of what happens in the conference at the end of January. I hope I'll be able to invite all three of you back. Hakim Al-Masmari in Sana'a, Michael Griffin in London, and Bill ROGGIO in Philadelphia. Gentlemen, thank you for your time and your insight. I know it's never enough time to discuss this in half an hour. Hopefully we'll come back and have another conversation in the not too distant future. And a very big thank you for watching this edition of Inside Story. We do welcome your comments and suggestions. Please do email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. I'm Sahil Rahman. Thanks very much for your time and your company.